I'm delighted to welcome you to the 13th lecture in our series of online talks dealing with various aspects of sporting art. Again, I'd like to thank Jamie Rountree of the Rountree Tryon Gallery for sponsoring these talks. It means that we can continue to put them on for free. I would also like to remind you that you can access any of the previous talks through the BSAT website. Again, we're recording this talk for future reference. Today, our speaker is Oliver Cox, Dr. Oliver Cox. Oliver is a man in transition. Not what you think. Since March 2022, Oliver has been on secondment to the National Trust from his job as Heritage Engagement Fellow at the University of Oxford. At the V&A, his next job, I think you start in 10 days, do you? Or in August. His primary responsibility is to build partnerships with academic institutions to help students work their way through our fast-moving world using the resources of the V&A. His recent work at the National Trust was on a British Academy Fellowship to explore how to move visitors to galleries and museums from passive consumption to active engagement with historical buildings and collections. I hope his work leads beyond the noise and bright lights of the displays in the Football Museum. Oliver's research interests concentrate on the social, cultural and political position of the British country house. He's encouraging a cross-fertilization of disciplines that can use their archives and collections as a source of ideas and new research. It is one of those houses with an important sporting art collection that Oliver will talk about today. His talk is entitled Building a Sporting Art Collection, the Fourth Marquess of Bute and the Bute Collection at Mount Stuart. As usual, Oliver, as Sally said at the beginning, Oliver is happy to answer questions at the end of his talk. The procedure, as she said, is to use the Q&A button to the right of your screen, the bottom right of your screen. You type the questions and I put the questions to Oliver at the end. So with that brief introduction, over to you, Oliver.
Tim, thank you ever so much and good morning, everyone. It's a thrill to be with you virtually, which is probably for the best because I tested positive for COVID this morning, which is always joyous. And thank you also for distracting yourselves from the bright lights of 10 Downing Street. Who will still be in the cabinet by the end of my talk today is an interesting betting game in itself. I'm just going to share my screen with you and we will crack on. Perfect. There we go. So what I would like to, well, I'm going to talk to you today about the Fourth Marquess of Bute and the Bute collection at Mount Stuart. Before I get started, I just wanted to thank Sally, Tim and the British Sporting Art Trust for inviting me to speak to you all online this morning, and also to the Rountree Tryon Gallery for generously sponsoring the whole series. So the topic of my talk today, if I can just get the thing working. Oops, hang on a minute. Sorry about that. So the topic of my talk today emerges from a sustained engagement I was lucky to have with this place here, Mount Stuart on the Isle of Bute, a merely 35-minute train ride out of Glasgow Central to Wemyss Bay. You hop across the ferry on the Clyde from Wemyss Bay to Rothesay, and then it's a taxi or a sort of drive up the hill to Mount Stuart. Where between 2015 and 2019, I worked as a consultant there to help them build a wider range of academic partnerships. So we organised paid internships for students. We explored the potential of partnering with US institutions. The sort of starting point for that was, some of you may remember the Enlightened Princesses exhibition that was at Kensington Palace back in, I think it was 2017. Now, Mount Stuart have got a really cracking Alan Ramsey portrait of Augusta the Dowager Princess of Wales, that the Yale Centre for British Art and Historic Royal Palaces wanted to borrow. So that was a sort of starting point for a much broader conversation about how we might work in partnership. And we also delivered an exhibition called The Art of Power, Treasures from the Bute Collection, which ran at the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow between March and October 2017. And what this interaction with the team at Mount Stuart also allowed me to do was get into the archives and have a look at their extraordinary collections. And I was also able to bring a few friends along for the ride. Some of you will recognise Professor Stephen Parisian, who used to run the National Horse Racing Museum in Newmarket. Steve and I know each other. I used to be one of his trustees at Compton Verney. So there's Steve manfully holding Bonnie Prince Charlie's sword, which was just one of the many treasures that we were exploring in the Mount Stuart archives. But one area that really piqued my interest was the rapid development of a sporting art collection in the first half of the 18th century. Now, the reason for a young, virile-looking me here on the slide is that I've long had an interest in equine histories, prompted both by a kind of family connection. On the one hand, my grandfather used to be a racing journalist, sued by Scobie Breesley for libel back in the 60s, went on to become secretary for the British Racehorse Owners Association before being general manager at Doncaster Racecourse. And so there's that personal connection, but then there's also a sort of historical link. And it was really the remark by the historian of 18th century Britain, Paul Langford, who in his Polite and Commercial People, England 1727 to 83, remarked that Westminster and Newmarket were more or less interchangeable venues of social and political life. So I became very interested in the ways in which people convene around horses. And I think that's an ongoing, fascinating conversation if one thinks of the money that the Altani family have ploughed into racing across Europe, you know, similarly to what's happened with the World Cup and their ownership of large swathes of London. There's some political work that is going on here, and I've become very interested in the ways in which that work is performed. So for the kind of 18th century side of this story, please do have a read of my article back in 2019 that looked at the ways in which the third Earl of Bute, George III's first prime minister, used horses as a way of navigating the shifting political sands of the 1760s. But what I want to do today is provide a pen portrait of what I think is a very significant sporting art collection that helps us both understand the dynamics of the art market at the start and the end of the 20th century, and suggests that this man on your screen here, John Crichton Stuart, the fourth Marquess of Bute, should be seen as a collector and patron of some significant repute, at a time that's more usually associated with aristocratic retrenchment, which I guess is a polite way of saying a fire sale. So born in 1881, Stuart inherited the marquisate as a minor in 1900 before coming of age in 1902. And a note in the catalogue of sporting pictures compiled in 1968 suggests that a depiction of a king vulture by the Scottish animal and avian painter Edwin Alexander was, I quote, the first painting bought by the fourth Marquess of Bute. And in this assiduous and determined collecting policy, the fourth Marquess was guided and assisted by the rare book and art dealer Francis Harvey. Harvey was a significant actor in the market and has frequently been confused by scholars either with his father, who died in 1900, his father's firm at 4 St James's Street, which he inherited in 1900 as well, and with a Major Francis Harvey, who was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. So our Francis Harvey is none of those people, but what he is someone that had had a long-standing relationship with the Butes. Harvey's father, for example, had bought the 13th century Mirthly Hours for the third Marquess in 1887. And the earliest record of an interaction between the fourth Marquess and Francis Harvey is from about 1905, when Harvey sold Bute, I quote, a charter of David II, King of Scots. And just to help understand where Harvey is kind of positioning himself in the early 20th century art market, he takes out adverts in the Burlington magazine, in advertising old engravings and sporting pictures, and was paid in 1930 £125 for visiting Cardiff House, Bute House, Edinburgh, Mount Stuart and Dumfries House, and reporting on the condition of the pictures, in addition to making a detailed valuation of the 735 pictures spread across the fourth Marquess's many properties. Harvey's valuation of pictures and engravings was delivered in July 1930 and is a really helpful document for kind of reconstructing the collection at that particular moment in time. He provided a total valuation of £609,725 in 1930s money, including pictures valued at £561,825 excuse me, and engravings valued at 47,000. And of these pictures, only 11 were described as sporting pictures. So that's where we are in 1930, a small bijou collection of sporting art. And what I've been able to do through this research is kind of reconstruct the development of this collection. The collection of notes, memoranda, and draft inventories in a painting file at Mount Stuart labelled pictures, sporting, old lists, etc., combined with picture accounts from 1910 to 1944, really enable a detailed account of the fourth Marquess's purchases. And he started off in quite impressive fashion in 1929, when one of the earliest works he bought was also one of the most significant. This is George Stubbs's Lord Torrington's Hunt Servants Setting Out from Suttle, which is not perhaps one of Stubbs's most famous works. However, for those proud owners of Judy Edgerton's catalogue Resonate, the painting has been staring back out at them since the publication of that landmark piece of scholarship in 2007. Now, I don't, alas, have time today to go into the sad story of Lord Torrington, but suffice to say that around 14 years after the picture was commissioned, it ended up as lot 51 at Christie's, where it was sold as 3 horses and grooms with dogs, etc., belonging to Lord Torrington. And the painting was sold to one of Stubbs's most ardent and loyal patrons, the Smithfield meat dealer William Wildman, for 15 guineas. 9 years later, the painting would be back on the block at Christie's, where it was sold from the posthumous sale of Wildman's collection for £22, 10 shillings and 6pence to a Mr. Middleton. For the next 142 years, the painting remained in the Middleton family collection before returning to Christie's for a third and final time in the summer of 1929. Now, it's worth saying that 1929 was an auspicious year for Stubbs. In Brussels, Stubbs's portrait, this one here on your screen here, of Torrington's friend and financial crutch, the third Duke of Portland, was one of the stars of the retrospective exhibition of British art at the Musée Moderne. Frank Rutter, in his review for The Spectator, wrote of the delightful triple fusion of people, landscapes, and animals that were, I quote, seen in more than one of Stubbs's masterpieces at the Sassoon. So that was Philip Sassoon's exhibition of English conversation pieces that had happened earlier that year, and are conspicuously evident in the superb painting of the third Duke of Portland, which was so much admired when lent to the British Art Exhibition at Brussels. Here, indeed, oh, sorry, excuse me, I'm just going to put myself on mute while I have a momentary coughing fit. Great. Here, indeed, with a prodigal generosity, the artist has added a fourth architectural element of interest to his composition. I'm so sorry, everyone. I will be off camera just for 1 minute while I just have a quick drink of water, and then we'll get back to Stubbs at the Musée Moderne in 1929. So yes, as I was saying, there was the review of the exhibition of this painting in the 30s sort of really highlighted this idea of bringing animals into the landscape. 1929 also saw the beginning of the dedicated art historical study of Stubbs, with the publication of Walter Shaw's Sparrows, George Stubbs and Ben Marshall, alongside detailed articles in Country Life and the Burlington magazine. So this critical and scholarly recognition of the qualities of 18th century sporting art, and Stubbs's work in particular, came at a time of record prices in the auction room. And this is where our painting takes centre stage once more. On the 19th of July 1929, Christie's sold the painting for £4,410, a new world record price for a work by George Stubbs, and approximately 200 times its previous sale price. The painting was one of 4 lots purchased from the Christie's sale by the London office of the New York dealer Nerdler and Co. And you can just about see it there. Number in the stock book is number 878. G. Stubbs, Huntsman Setting Out, lot 47 from that Christie's sale in London on the 19th of July 1929. And it spent a month on the stock books before being sold for £5,500 to Colnaghi. And so here's the movement out into the Colnaghi, out of the stock book and into Colnaghi's holdings. The painting was then bought from Colnaghi by John Crichton Stuart, the 4th Marquess of Bute, after that point. So here we are. This is the the list of pictures bought in 1929, and I think it's it's interesting to just sort of think about where Stubbs's the Stubbs work sits alongside other purchases being made at the time. So as you can see, he bought from Christie's the Stubbs painting, and then he also purchased from the sale of Lord Yarborough an incredibly valuable portrait by Holbein of the young Edward VI, which by the late 80s, everybody thought was kind of school of Holbein, and it was certainly, and I think it was sold by Mount Stuart School of Holbein, and everyone's pretty certain is it now actually by Holbein. So an interesting question around sort of art historical attribution. So this is the way that one picture in particular makes its way into the collection. And just to read out the entry. So the entry in the Bute picture account states that bought at the sale by Nerdler and purchased from them, suggesting that Colnaghi may have bought the painting from Nerdler on behalf of Bute's agent, the dealer Francis Harvey. And returning to those London stock books of Nerdler in the summer of 1929, the large amount of sporting art available in the sale rooms is striking, and how the majority of the paintings were bought by American collectors and institutions. In this context, the 4th Marquess of Bute stands out as an English aristocrat collector buying at a time more commonly associated with country house fire sales. So going back to this valuation of pictures completed the following year, oops, sorry, 1 second. Okay. So here's the valuation of the pictures from the following year. Of the 625 paintings listed, as I've mentioned earlier, 11 were categorized as sporting, and here you are. There's a Henry and Samuel Alcombe, an anonymous painting, one by Francis Barlow, George Morland, Ben Marshall, Thomas Spencer, Stubbs, Dean Wolstenholme, and John Wootton. 11 of these are categorized as sporting. 6 of them, including the Stubbs, are hanging at Cardiff Castle. The Marquess's most recent purchase, Wootton's portrait of the racehorse Leeds, hung in his London office at 26 Queen Anne's Gate, while other purchases, Marshall's Grimalkin, Dean Wolstenholme's The Finish, and Thomas Spencer's Victorious, were displayed in his London home at 39 Belgrave Square. And I'd argue that Bute's new collection of sporting pictures was the dominant thread throughout the first half of the 1930s, with Harvey recorded most frequently in the painting accounts. In 1930, for example, 13 out of 19 pictures purchased were sporting, with 15 in total from Harvey. The next year was similar, with 23 new pictures, of which 15 were sporting and 14 purchased from Harvey. 18 pictures were purchased the following year in 1932, despite the Marquess's secretary, Mary Power, writing to the fantastically named dealer, Commander Avakiev, that the Marquess, I quote, is not interested in any kind of pictures at the present moment. He is still limiting his expenditure as far as possible, pending better times and lower income tax. Will things ever improve? She asked. Now, by the end of the 1930s, with with war on the horizon, the sporting pictures were redistributed around the family's houses. In 1938, 85 sporting pictures, along with gas masks from the basement, were sent from 39 Belgrave Square to Cardiff Castle. A total of 99. So here's the movement of the sporting pictures. A total of 99 sporting pictures are included in a complete list compiled from about late 1938 to 1940, with 80 hung in the stables. Those not hung in the stables, including the Alcombe's hunting and coursing scenes in Lady Bute's room, Fernley's Lord Whitworth, and the Stubbs in the drawing room. So I think the fourth Marquess clearly saw his sporting collection as a discrete part of the wider family holdings, but one which had the potential to be a capsule collection that was representative of the most preeminent examples of British sporting art from the late 16th to the late 19th century. And an intriguing document in the picture file suggests the extent to which this was a carefully calibrated collection. On a single page, sporting artists are split into 32 existing and 24 to get. I kind of love this. It's a sort of amazing shopping list that really sort of gives you a sense of the sort of, I think there is a really quite sort of systematic approach to collecting here. Now, Bute's works of art were not just limited to paintings in oil on canvas. It's very likely that a bound folio containing 89 old pencil sketches of celebrated racehorses was purchased by the fourth Marquess. These preparatory drawings by James Seymour, bought from the collection of Sir John St Aubyn and dating from around 1744 to 46, do not appear in the picture accounts, but may be related to the 4 drawings by the same artist purchased by Bute in November 1936. Bute also purchased a really intriguing bound manuscript called Horse Racing and Cockfighting at Newmarket between 1719 and 1757. A pencil note on the flyleaf gives an indication into the potential reasons for this purchase. I quote, "This manuscript is unique insofar as it gives the colours of the riders. It cannot be found in any printed publication." The manuscript had first been sold out of the library of Sir Thomas Thornhill of Riddlesworth in 1889 to Lord Rosebery for £7. Bute bought the manuscript for £16 at the sale of Lord Rosebery's library at the Durdens, Epsom, in July 1933. And I think horse races, this manuscript I think there's huge potential for this. I think really interesting piece of really interesting resource that could be really gone through in a very systematic way, and I'm sure all sorts of interesting and exciting insights into the development of horse racing in the early 18th century would accrue from that. But again, no time for that today. By the end of the 1950s, and with the death of the 4th Marquess in 1947 and of the 5th Marquess in 1956, the majority of the sporting pictures had been transferred to Mount Stuart and were split between the South Passage, where there were 12 pictures, the Lilac Suite Lobby, where there were 7, the Lilac Drawing Room, where there were 6, the Lilac Bedroom, there were 10, the Garden Passage had 11, the Pink Bedroom 12, Lord Bute's office 5, and the Drawing Room had 14. The 6th Marquess later placed 17 paintings on loan to the Turf Club at 5 Carlton Terrace, London, including Sartorius's A Match on the Beacon Course, Newmarket. Notice the headless rider in the middle there. A version of, a sort of scene that's familiar to all of us, one of Wootton's renderings of Warren Hill at Newmarket. So those were on loan for a long period of time, actually, to the Turf Club. And the first summary of the sporting pictures was produced in 1968. Now, the Stubbs painting remains the jewel in the crown of the Bute collection of sporting pictures, especially after the dispersal of 53 lots through Christie's in 1999. The Marquess of Dufferin and Ava, the curator of the Arts Council of Great Britain's touring exhibition British Sporting Painting 1650 to 1850 in 1974, borrowed 32 works from Mount Stuart, including, despite initial reluctance from the 6th Marquess of Bute, the Stubbs. And this was a coup for Dufferin, who wrote to Bute to say how he was so happy when I got your letter that I actually forgot the miners' strike for nearly 20 minutes. Norbert Linton, the director of exhibitions for the Arts Council, expressed his satisfaction in a more bureaucratic tone. The paintings that Sheridan Dufferin has recommended to us out of your collection would make a most valuable contribution. We have little doubt that this exhibition will prove of interest to a large public as well as specialists. So what I hope I've been able to show you in between my coughing and spluttering over the last 25 minutes is the extent to which a combination of really impeccable record keeping, generous access provided to those records, and a bit of time to follow through some narrative threads has enabled us to kind of recreate this really interesting collecting campaign in the 1930s by the 4th Marquess of Bute. The extent to which this sporting art collection remains, I don't know, surprisingly separate from the rest of the Bute's collection. And the fact that much of it goes on loan at various points, and when it comes to the late 90s, it's seen as a part of the collection that's relatively easy to kind of ship off and quite self-contained. Suggests that this is a really interesting opportunity to think about the ways in which sporting art collections can be were assembled in the 20th century, what you might buy if money was pretty much no object. So I think, we can certainly assume that when Bute is writing to Commander Avakiev, that there is, I don't think he's hugely worried about income tax or retrenchment. What the relative increase of available art on the market does for patrons of repute with dealers and advisors that can help them navigate the markets. So that's to sort of give you just a bit of a sense of the Bute collection. And just before I finish, I'd be delighted to take questions. I just want to flag a piece of work that is just beginning to happen with our colleagues at the National Trust, and will continue after I leave to take on my new position at the V&A, which is we are turning our attention to horses, you'll be delighted to know. Through a research partnership with the University of Oxford, we're working with the National Trust on 11 large-scale research themes that hopefully provide a way of knitting together the Trust's broad and diverse property portfolio. One of these themes is around, we're calling it horsepower, and it's around the equine histories, the variety of different types of equine history you can tell at National Trust sites, from the Iron Age story of agricultural development through to the 21st century. And one of the things that we're addressing, of course, is the sporting art collections within that. And there's a real sense amongst the curatorial community that certainly in case of the sort of almost limitless number of portraits of racehorses, of hunters, of coach horses that sit on National Trust, on the walls of National Trust properties, that those pictures aren't doing enough work for visitors. That we're really missing a trick in terms of the kinds of stories that we could use them as springboards to. The way in which we can talk about the twin concerns of sort of equine and equine and human bloodstock, the way in which horses help us understand how communities and both at a local, regional, national and international level were knitted together through the exchange of bloodstock. And more broadly, to help us think about the kind of transport revolution that the domestication of the horse enables, and then certainly from the 18th century onwards, those dramatic changes in road transportation. And that feels like quite a timely thing to be doing as we embark on, over what will be, I'm sure, over the next 10 years, a complete revolution in the way in which we all travel through electric cars and whatnot. So I hope what I've been able to do today is give you a little pen portrait of a really, bijou but impactful collection that existed for a time on the Isle of Bute and in the other Bute family houses, and a sense that I think there's a new energy, certainly in the UK's largest heritage organisation, around the importance of sporting art, and a renewed enthusiasm for using those paintings as a sort of jumping off point for a wider range of stories. So thank you ever so much for your attention. I'm really looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And thank you for soldiering on manfully through your spluttering and coughing. Please have some water to mark the next phase of the talk. I hope your legacy of your work at the National Trust will be an increased enthusiasm for sporting art. I'm well aware of the number of sporting art pictures that there are in the National Trust collections, and they sit there, as you say, on the wall, but what do we know about them? What stories do they tell? Why are they there? Is rarely taken up. I've been working with both Clarendon, sadly having to look at pictures in store that they rescued from the fire, but also with Wimpole and with Waddesdon. And I think there's one picture at Waddesdon that we're going to be able to talk about a lot in the future. We've almost rescued its history and identified where it fits into horse racing history. So there's a lot of work that can be done, and we as the British Sporting Art Trust would be very happy to collaborate with you on the projects, or with your successors anyway, which and I've seen an enthusiasm from the curators at each of those locations that want us to work more, identify more, and take more out of these pictures that we know quite well. One of the first questions is, what do we know about Marquess of Bute and sport? Was he a sportsman? It's not a name that crops up much in the world of sport, and yet he had this enthusiasm for collecting sporting pictures.
It's a really great question, actually, Tim. I and something that I wrestled with in writing this, because yes, he doesn't sort of appear on the, you know, the sort of hallowed lists of great sportsmen of the period, and as far as I can tell, there's not actually a huge enthusiasm for, you know, owning racehorses or anything like that. So I think what I couldn't quite get to the bottom of, and it's still an open question in my mind, is the question of motivation for this collection, because in this particular sporting art collection, is this a canny commercial investment at a time where prices are going up, and you know, he's active he's a buyer in a seller's market, and so he's, you know, it's a sort of commercial investment, you know, or is this because of a deep interest in the subject matter, or at least in the paintings themselves. And I think it's more at the latter end of the spectrum. And I think one of the things that we sort of struggle with is the fourth Marquess's correspondence. Some of it's kind of catalogued, quite a lot of it isn't. So that was quite difficult to navigate, to find sort of any reference. But my educated guess would be, you know, the desire to buy the Seymour sketchbook, for example. I think that points to a level of interest in the kind of, you know, in the practice of sporting art, and you know, there's certainly you know, enthusiasm. You know, actually a fair few of them are still up at Mount Stuart. Sort of, you know, he's you know, with a gas and other sort of, you know, paintings of sort of carriage horses and carriages on the move. I think there's a great interest in that. And I suppose, you know, where I sort of read into that, I guess, given that so much of the family's, you know, fortune by the early 20th century had come from being, you know, very actively involved in the kind of, you know, in the industrialization of Cardiff, and the movement of goods and people. You know, who knows? Perhaps there's a level of interest there.
What's one of the things I'm keenly interested in is the history of sporting art, and the enthusiasms that come and go, and it was ignored through much of the 20th century as an academic study, and then increasing interest after the Shaw Sparrow book. And was there an element of that going on, that there was a renewed interest in sporting art in 29-30? I picked up a number of articles wanting a national sporting art collection to be formed. He seemed to be wanting individual artists represented in his collection, and from that page that you showed of in the collection and to get, they were not pictures, they were artists that were being listed.
I think it's a really superb point, and it ties into some of the conversations that he tries to open up with, I guess, the forerunner of HMRC in the late 1930s, where he's looking to create a museum space on the outskirts of Cardiff. Then he gets very worried because it's too near the Bridgend, wouldn't it? It's too near the Bridgend oil refinery. So he's very worried that if the Nazis bombed it, that his paintings would blow up as well. And that's the thing that kind of puts paid to the idea of building a gallery in Wales, is the fear that they'd be destroyed. So I think the idea of them as a coherent collection that tells the story of British sporting art is very much there. And I think you're right that it's almost the subject of the paintings themselves, I don't think are as significant as the artist's names, and I think there is an attempt that it becomes, you know, that it is seen as kind of representative of a particular moment in time. And I guess the success of that is probably measured by that Arts Council show in '74, the British Sporting Arts Show, because Bute lends 33 pictures to the show. I think he's the largest single private lender, private or institutional, I think, to the show. So I think in that sense, there's a level of kind of, if you like, curatorial and academic validation of that process of collecting from the 30s that comes 40 years later, which of course the fourth Marquess doesn't live to see, because it's the sixth that is involved in the negotiations around the show. But I think just the extent to which that show relies upon the Bute collection is significant. And I think within that, the activities of the Marquess of Dufferin and Ava are pretty important as well. He goes on a sort of week-long trip up to Bute to try and soften up the sixth Marquess, and as I say, eventually gets the agreement to that the paintings will be loaned. And the other thing that we could do with that as well is just track, because they've got all the government indemnity stuff still in the archives at Mount Stuart. So I think one thing I haven't spoken about today too much is the way in which the purchase prices, or at least the insurance valuations, increase as well. So one could do something quite interesting with that documentation.
Well, did he have, or did the family have any sporting connections? Or is it just him on his own that's showing this interest in sporting art?
A really good question. So the historic collections, or at least the Bute collection really starts in earnest with the third Earl in the sort of 1730s, and he's very much not a patron of Stubbs at all, and I think is seen very much by Stubbs's patrons, Rockingham, Portland et al., as kind of devil incarnate. At that sort of first, the sort of Stubbs flowering of sporting art moment, third Earl is not engaged in buying that kind of work at all. He's interested in he's much more interested in Dutch pictures. So he's buying loads of Kuyps and things like that, and Van Ruysdaels and so on. The 19th century collections, again, there is not what I would see as a sort of recognizable there's not a recognizable subset of sporting art within it, and it really is from the late 1920s that we start to see this. There isn't really much taxidermy kicking around either, so it does feel like quite a sort of personal interest. I mean, worth saying that you could make the claim that the whole the family's fortunes are absolutely transformed because of horse racing, because it's at the Egham races in the late 1740s that the third Earl and then the then Prince of Wales and the Dowager Duchess Augusta, well, no, she's not Dowager yet because her husband hasn't died. So, and Augusta meet. So, one, I don't know.
Isn't that where the Prince of Wales was killed by a cricket ball?
Yes, yeah. So they meet 70, I think it's 1747, they meet at Egham races, which I only realised a couple of months ago is on the sort of water meadow at Runnymede, which I hadn't, it just hadn't clocked in my mind that was the location. So we were there with the trust a few weeks ago, and I suddenly had this moment where I was like, oh Christ, it's here. And I think that's going back to the sort of 18th century part of this story, that for me was a real start of interest, because it gave me the sense that the race course does something, is a different kind of space in 18th century Britain, that enables a certain degree, I think there's much more social fluidity in it, and it's both polite and anarchic, and there's something about that kind of hybrid nature of it that I think enables really, really interesting things to happen. So I think by extension, you could say for the Butes, you know, things, it's that chance meeting at the races that well, is it chance? I mean, you know, the third Earl is positioning himself, but you know, the stars align, if you like, and he's at the Prince's table, and away we go. But yes, I think, you know, where my interest there is, it's around this kind of, and I think the fascination with those, you know, certainly the Newmarket pictures and things like that, it's just, it's this illustration of proximity, you know, when politics is personal, proximity matters. And I think these pictures really help us explain that kind of story.
Well, I'm interested in that, but particularly I'm doing work on the 1680s, taking it further back and using the picture at Waddesdon to illustrate that a lot of the race meetings at that time were political rather than commercial operations. What I make of it, I don't know, but that's the work I'm doing at the moment. I think the final thing, the fourth Marquess seems a very private man. He didn't talk much about what he was trying to do, as far as I can see. Is the museum at Cardiff, was it a real goer, or was it just a pipe dream that he was thinking about at the time?
I think there was real I think he, good question. It's real enough that he is prepared to go through, there's at least 18 months worth of back and forth with his lawyers, trying to work through what a kind of settlement with the state could look like. And I think that, and I think that there are, you know, I think there are overlapping motivations for that. I think there's a sort of a level of kind of there's a level of sort of financial prudence in some ways that is combined with, I do think, a sense that part of Wales is underserved culturally. So in some ways, you know, I think it's quite a progressive thought. But he's very clear in his instructions for how he would like the museum to be arranged, that it's going to be arranged sort of typologically. So, you know, he does not want sporting art to hang with, you know, portraiture. You know, he's very clear that he wants kind of separate rooms for each of these, for the different aspects of his collection. There's no mention, interestingly, of Descartes. You know, given that his dad, you know, had been sort of such a great patron of William Burgess. But yeah, so I think it is a serious thought. I think it's the war that really puts pay to it, because of the his anxieties about location, and I think, you know, it's not. Yeah, I think there's a sense.
Well, he seems a man that we should write into the history of the display of sporting art.
Yes,
he isn't there at the moment, as far as I can see.
Yes, I think there could be. I think I would say there's more to be done, and I certainly felt on that kind of Cardiff story about display, I only really scratched the surface.
Just a couple of, what happened to the Seymour drawings? Are they still in the collection?
Still there.
Because I think some of the best work that Seymour did. It seemed to be a bit wooden, but his drawings are extremely lively, and
it would be wonderful to. I mean that folio is fabulous, and it's really it's a great insight into the way he works. You know, how he, you know, and the level of precision involved in that kind of portraiture, and it has, you know, and there's, I mean, all of the sitters, both human and equine, are named. So there's a whole piece of work that could be done on that one sketchbook, definitely, which hasn't been done and should be done.
It should be done, yes. We've been working on the catalogue raisonné with Richard Wills. So I presume he's seen the sketchbook. I don't know. So it's good that they're still in the collection. The rest of the collection was dispersed, was it?
Yeah, the majority in 1999 with the sale of Christie's. Francis Russell writes the sort of the sort of summary catalogue, which is the closest we got to a sort of a pen portrait of the fourth Marquess.
Oliver, thank you very much. You've soldiered on, as I said earlier, and thank you for that. We did ask you whether you wanted to postpone, and I'm delighted that you said you would continue on. So thank you for that. We've now seen a live man with COVID struggling. Thank you very much. And I think your future work, we should keep in touch as the BSAT, and also follow up all the legacy that you created at the National Trust. I think it will be extremely helpful and help to put sporting art more on the map than it has been. So thank you for that. I think there's a genuine legacy there of your few months with the National Trust. Right, as Sally said earlier, we will take a summer break and return in September. On the 15th of September, the 5th Thursday, David Haycock is going to talk about Lucy Kemp Welsh, Her Private World. It will be at 11 o'clock. And just to remind you, there is currently an exhibition of her work at Palace House, which I would encourage you to see. But also the talk is a prelude to a major exhibition of her work next year. Do you have anything else to add, Sally?
Just would like to say that we're currently going through the organisational stage of the Paul Mellon lecture, which again will be on the Turf Club on the 10th of November. And we're carrying on this theme because Martin Postle from the Paul Mellon Centre will be talking about the Art in the Country House project that Oliver was part of, and giving us an overview of that. And that's on the 10th of November, Turf Club. That will be coming into your inboxes shortly.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Oliver. It's much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sally.
Okay.
See everybody in September over Zoom. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye.